Good day. Welcome to Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation's web talk in our series Unapologetic Zionism. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of the CAEF and today's moderator. Today we are fortunate to have partnered with Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights and Regavim. The co-chair of CILR, Goldie Steiner, is with us and will introduce our special guest, Naomi Kahn, in a few minutes. The Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation is a registered Canadian charity engaged in educating Canadians about anti-Semitism, which masquerades as anti-Zionism. We are actively promoting the adoption and implementation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism and its principles by all levels of government and public institutions. The IHRA is a key tool in the battle to combat anti-Semitism. Another key tool is developing strong relationships with other organizations, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and ensuring that people know the truth of Jewish history and Israel's legal, biblical, and historic rights. CILR and Regavim are two NGOs that are also committed to teaching these truths. As well, our partners agree that standing strong and proud as Jews and as Zionists is imperative in combating anti-Semitism, defending Israel, and ensuring Jewish survival and the safety of our children and grandchildren. The Jewish people are the original people, and Jews formed their first national home in ancient Israel millennia ago. Jews have legal rights to reconstitute the Jewish homeland in Israel as agreed to by the United Nations and confirmed in international law. You will learn more about the heartland of the Jewish people from our speaker, someone who is an unapologetic Zionist. You may submit your questions via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen, and Naomi will address these following her presentation. This web talk will be recorded and posted on the CAEF and CILR websites tomorrow. Please refer to it and listen again and share it widely. Please consider making a donation to CAEF so that we may continue to bring you informative expert speakers and build strategic initiatives in our effort to combat anti-Semitism. And now Goldie will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I promise you are in for a great treat. Naomi, it's my pleasure to meet you, and thank you for accepting our invitation. I just want to add that I'm delighted to reconnect with Regavim after many years when it was under Ari Britt's pioneering undertaking, whom I had the honor to meet during his last visit to Toronto prior to his departure. And now your bio. Naomi Kahn received degrees in political science and Near Eastern languages and literature from New York University. She served as director of the School of Judaic Studies and of Education at Lander Institute of Jerusalem, and is a well-known editor and translator. Mrs. Kahn is the director of the International Division at Regavim, a research-based think tank and lobbying group dedicated to the protection and preservation of Israel's sovereignty. Together with her husband Ari, she raised her 5 children in Givat Zev, an Israeli settlement formed in 1977, where the family has lived for over 35 years. Back to you, Andrea.
Well, it's now time for Naomi's presentation, and thank you, Goldie. We'll have questions after the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome. I want to particularly thank Goldie for making the introduction to Andrea and to all of you out there whom I cannot see. So we're getting adjusted to the new normal of the Corona distance. As you can see, the background of this picture is actually, this is just a picture, but this is really pretty close to where I am now. I'll tell you more about that. But first I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit more about Regavim, and then try to bring together the different strands of what we want to actually discuss this evening, which is Israel's legal rights, what is the Zionist vision, and how does all that come together in Judea and Samaria on a personal level. As was mentioned, I've been in Israel for more than half my life. The percentages are getting better all the time. I like to hope that they will continue to improve. My husband and I got on the plane 7 nights after our wedding in 1984. And we've been here ever since. And yes, we just had our 5th grandchild, all of them here in Israel. There is no better place to be. So let me try to share some slides now with you that will explain where I'm standing and why. So here we are. Let's start here. I'm going to go back. So again, Regavim is an Israeli NGO dedicated to protecting Israel's resources, primarily our most important, most hotly contested, and most basic resource, which is also pretty much our rarest resource, and that is the land itself. So Regavim takes an almost pixelated view of the land of Israel, goes from the very smallest units down on the ground, goes out into the field every day. We divide the country up into 4 regions, and we go out and see what's out there, what's happening to our land resources, who's doing what, who's allowed to do what, who owns what, and why. If something is changed, who's made that change? Were they allowed to make that change? And if not, what can be done about it? Who's responsible for protecting our land resources, and are they doing their job? So the way we do this, oops, sorry. I'm having trouble sharing the screen right now. But the topic of our talk this evening, again, this is just a little bit of a look of where I'm standing actually right now. And it's glorious. This was taken about a week ago. Things are still green, but starting to turn brown before the rains. And this is how we do what we do. So here you see in your top left-hand corner, Director General Mayor Deutsch, 2 of our field workers. One of them is now, has taken a position with the JNF, with the CAEF Israel, and is in charge of protecting land resources from a different angle now. That is Ovad Arad. But this is how we do it. We go out in the field, we document, we take pictures, we use technology, we use drones, we use aerial photos, we use GIS mapping, and we see what's out there. We create maps to figure out what we're looking at, and we then connect the dots to try to see what patterns emerge, to try to understand what policy is involved, who's doing, who's pulling the strings, and what the effects for the long-term Zionist vision and for the future of the state of Israel are. So, sorry. I'm going to give you a very, very brief history lesson in order to bring you up to where I am now. For many of you, this will be very well-known information, but it's always worth refreshing our memory because the history will dictate exactly what it is we're talking about when I say something is legal or illegal. How does it become that way? So what you're looking at here is the map of the British mandate for Palestine that was agreed to at the Cairo Conference of 1922, in which the nations of the world, or the powers that had won the First World War, set aside a land for the creation of a Jewish homeland. This entire area, both of the yellowish colors, was set aside for a Jewish homeland. And the British government was placed in charge of the territory with the express mandate of maintaining the status quo until such time as an independent Jewish state could be established in this area. Very, very rapidly, the British forgot what their mandate was and chopped the lion's share of the territory off and handed it to Emir Abdallah for all sorts of reasons that had to do with geopolitics, creating Transjordan, the state of Jordan as it is known today. Please notice that even when Jordan was created, everything to the west of the Jordan River, which is, I'll try to show you with my finder here, everything to the west was still to be the Jewish homeland. So this is Jordan. What became Jordan? this was still set aside for Jewish sovereignty. And this is where, this is what the map of Israel should have looked like according to the world powers as of 1922. Next, the next map, and we're going to see a lot of maps because that's what we do. This is really a breakdown of the British, essentially this was supposed, all of this, on this side, the east was also originally envisioned for for the state of Israel. It didn't work out that way. But this is the next attempt to create a two-state solution. Again, we're going back here. This was the first attempt to create a two-state solution, and it didn't work, right? We had Jordan, we had Palestine. When the British created Jordan, it was meant to bring peace to the region, to prevent any more bloodshed because of all the Arab rioting and violence. So this was the first attempt to create a two-state solution, and it was an abject failure. Then there was another attempt to re-divide the remaining territory. This was the partition plan of 1947. Even though this was not a tenable solution, the Jewish community living in Israel, the Jewish leadership accepted the plan, the Arabs rejected it. So they rejected the second attempt at a two-state solution. After the War of Independence in 1948, this is what the map looked like. Notice that this section was illegally occupied during the hostilities. Jordan attacked and illegally occupied this area and renamed it. It had always been known as Judea and Samaria, and was renamed by Jordan the West Bank of Jordan in order to essentially rationalize or somehow paper over the fact that it had acquired territory illegally in an act of hostility. None of the countries of the world recognized Jordan's occupation or eventual annexation of this territory. And I mean none of the countries of the world, including all the Arab countries, the Arab League itself. Only 2 countries recognized Jordan's annexation of what they called the West Bank and what we continue to call Judea and Samaria. Those 2 countries were Great Britain and Pakistan. Possibly Iraq as well. That is a point that is debated. But all the other countries, including Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, all of the world powers as well, all rejected Jordan's active aggression and annexation in annexing this territory. So that's what the map looked like for 19 years. And 19 years later, in 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel reclaimed this area that had always been intended to be part of the Jewish homeland, right? This is the area that we're talking about. When we talk about Judea and Samaria or the West Bank, this is it. It was always intended to be part of Israel. Israel repatriated this area and the people living in it, but did not do what any other country would do as a result of a war of self-defense. It did not re-establish its presence there as a sovereign power. It decided voluntarily to consider these areas contested or conflict territory rather than occupied territory, because you can't possibly call it occupied territory under international law if it was not taken from another sovereign, legally recognized sovereign, and it wasn't. And you can't possibly occupy something that had always been intended to be part of your sovereign state. So the state of Israel decided to leave these areas in limbo, consider them contested territory, and not to extend Israeli law to these areas, but to maintain the system of law that was in effect when it was last under some recognized national sovereignty. And since Jordanian sovereignty was never recognized, the only previous sovereignty that it could rely upon, the only system of law that it could rely upon, was the law of the Ottoman Empire. Now, that's going to lead to all the complications I'm going to talk about further along, but it's important to keep in mind that Ottoman law, and then we're talking about 1967, yes? Ottoman law had been abandoned so many years before that, even by the Ottoman Empire, because it was a completely outmoded and impractical system, even under the Ottoman Empire. Under a democratic, modern Western style democracy like the State of Israel, this system of law is completely anathema to everything that we believe in. There is almost no such thing as property rights under Ottoman law. Under Ottoman law, for example, women cannot buy, sell, inherit property. And this is an astounding thing. And the State of Israel, even today, enforces this ridiculous system of law, which allows people to take other people's property simply by using it. If they're not evicted in due time, it becomes theirs. You are allowed to encroach on state land and plant on it, and as long as you can prove that you're using it for an agricultural purpose, it can become yours. All of these things go contrary to every Western, pretty much every system of law that we know of, but the State of Israel continues to enforce that system of law simply because of the geopolitical problem that it created when it did not immediately annex or repatriate these areas in 1967. So this is where I live, just to give you an idea of how complicated all of this becomes down on the ground on a personal level. I live in a place called Givat Ze'ev. It is here. Givat Ze'ev, I don't know how well you can see it here, but this is Jerusalem. This is Givat Ze'ev, all around here. The bright green areas are under full Palestinian control. The dark green areas are under Israeli control. These blotches are Arab towns, villages, settlements, whatever you want to call them. But then you have something else altogether. And sitting here in Givat Ze'ev, I can see out my window, if you would be able to see, it's actually nighttime here, so you can't see even if I weren't showing you a virtual background. From my window, I see Jerusalem, and I also see Ramallah. And I'm equidistant between the two. And it takes me less than 10 minutes to get to either one, right? So you have Ramallah, and you have Jerusalem, and you have all this other stuff going on all around. I'll explain to you what these brownish areas are soon. But what I want to talk to you about this evening are these black dots. These black dots are the crux of the matter, and they are essentially the battleground for the State of Israel's heartland that is going on all around us and has been for over 10 years, quietly, without anybody noticing it and without almost any noise. The only people who've been fighting this battle, more or less, are Regavim. So let's look at how this battleground came into being. What you're looking at here is a map that was created by the Oslo Accords. For those of you who are familiar with the terminology, what you're seeing here, the bright red is area A, the darker red is area B, all of this yellowish is the area C, and this green has to do with the Y plantation accords. These are nature reserves. So what are areas A, B, and C? Area A, a good way to remember it is A stands for Arafat, or Arabs. These areas are the Arab urban population centers that are under full Palestinian Authority jurisdiction. That includes policing, security, construction, infrastructure, education, health, everything, both civilian and security control. The darker red areas, these areas here, are the Arab rural population centers, villages, larger collections of Arab population in rural areas that are under the area B, that we like to say that stands for either beyachad, which means together, or balagan, which means chaos. And the reason that we say that is because area B, the civilian life in these areas is under full Palestinian Authority, and the state of Israel maintains security jurisdiction for the perimeter. So, oops, sorry. So, the rest of it is Area C. And Area C, the yellowish area, is what was placed under full Israeli jurisdiction by the Oslo Accords. I live in Area C. Every other Jewish person that you know, every Jewish community in Judea and Samaria, every settlement, every outpost, everything you've ever heard of is in Area C, because there are no Jews living in areas A or B. The problem is that in Area C, there are also many, many Arabs living in Area C. How many? No one knows. No one has ever done a census. And Area C, this yellowish area, is the battleground. This is where all the action is, unfortunately. And this is where the changes are happening. So I, for example, live just north of Jerusalem. And you can see that there's all sorts of other things going on here. These are the villages that I showed you in the up-close shot before. And this is how the map is supposed to look. The problem begins when the map doesn't really look the way the Oslo Accords have created it. The map really looks like this. It's exactly the same thing, except for all these purple dots. These purple dots were placed on the map by us, by Regavim, already several years ago. We went out into the field in Area C and we mapped out what was actually out there. And these purple dots are all illegal Bedouin outposts placed by the Palestinian Authority in strategic areas in Area C in order to take control of the territory and in order to block further development of Israeli contiguity and Jewish communities in Area C. Now, some of the claims that you'll often hear, there's two main claims in international forums about why these outposts are here and why Palestinian Authority construction is so concentrated in Area C. And I'd like to first tell you what those claims are and then explain why there's nothing to them. The first claim is that the Palestinians and Bedouins build in these areas illegally because they have nowhere else to go, because there's a crisis, there's a shortage of land, of available land for construction in areas A and B. Therefore, they're building in Area C. The second claim is that these things are only illegal because the state of Israel refuses to give permits. So they build, and they're considered illegal, but it's actually a fiction. So we went out into the field to check if any of this was true. First of all, we purchased GIS satellite photography of all of Judea and Samaria, and we mapped out all of the areas under Palestinian Authority jurisdiction to see if there was available land for construction. And we found that close to 70% of the land reserves in areas A and B are empty, absolutely empty. And the Palestinian Authority doesn't need our permission to develop these areas, to build, to expand existing or create new communities, but they're empty. And the second thing we found is that the civil administration has issued tens of thousands of permits for construction in the Arab sector. So both of the claims that we hear in international forums are actually completely false. And once we began to map out all these purple dots, we began to understand really what the truth is. We connected the dots and a picture emerges. All of these purple dots are placed here in order to create a geopolitical reality. They are placed very, very carefully in order to create a land bridge of contiguity that will be the backbone of the Palestinian state. Now you'll notice that, I don't know if you thought about it, but this huge pink blob here, all of this is Jordan. And all of this threatens Jordan even more than it threatens us. Because 80% of the people living here, as you can understand easily from this brief history lesson that we've just had, 80% of the people living here self-identify as Palestinians. So if you create a Palestinian state here, And the Jordanian royal family is essentially simply was imported from the Saudi Peninsula, and they don't really belong here and have very, very little to do with the population living here. This is a massive threat to the stability of the entire region, because Jordan cannot exist if it is in contest with a Palestinian state right next door. But that's a talk for another day. What we're interested in today is looking at all of this. What is it? How did it get here? And why is it here? And how important is it really for the future of the Zionist vision? So we began to go out into the field and try to figure out how these outposts were created. And we began to notice these structures over and over and over again. We found approximately 180 new outposts that don't appear on the map. And we noticed all of this. I hope you recognize what that is. That is the symbol of the European Union. The European Union sends advisors and sends equipment and sends structures, prefab structures, and creates water lines, that's what this is, digs wells, and creates new communities out of thin air in strategic points in Area C. They then populate these outposts with the people who are most easily manipulated and moved from place to place, and that is the Bedouin. Here we're going to get a few close-up looks of some of these outposts created, again, by European Union funding. And you'll notice they're almost always either just on the outskirts of a Jewish community or on major connecting routes. This one is on Route 1. We'll see it from closer up. Here you have it, what it looks like, and you'll notice all of these cookie cutter structures, all of them, have the EU symbol on them. It looks like this over and over and over again. And the European Union considers this or calls this humanitarian aid. It creates these outposts in places that it wants to take control of, pays people or supports people to live there, and creates a reality on the ground that is almost impossible to live in, because they're living in places that there's no sewage, there's no water lines, there's no electric lines, there's no access to these places. It's ridiculous conditions. And then they weep and moan in the United Nations that it's a humanitarian crisis because they have no water, no electricity, and no access. So they're creating these places, they're pumping money into them. And again, as I say, we tracked over 176, if I'm not mistaken, of these outposts. Each one is given a name and a narrative and a history. And before they're even up on the ground, the Palestinian Authority and the European Union sends lawyers to the Supreme Court of Israel asking for a legal protection so that these destitute and underprivileged people won't be removed from their homes. Homes, of course, that weren't there yesterday and shouldn't be there tomorrow, but they're there. And they're taking up a massive strategic role on the ground. So I'm going to show you now a few slides of one of the most famous of these outposts. This is an outpost that Regavim went to court over almost 12 years ago. The outpost is called Khan al-Ahmar, and it is just outside the Jewish community of Mitzpeh Yericho, right near, it's actually Kfar Adumim, right near Ma'ale Adumim, for those of you who know it. The very dark line that you see there is Route 1, the highway that connects the capital of Israel to the Dead Sea and beyond. It is the most important road. That's why it's called Route 1. It goes all the way through the country. Most of you have probably traveled from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv on Route 1. It's the same Route 1, just on the other side of Jerusalem. So this is how we do what we do. We collected aerial, in 2009, the residents of Kfar Adumim, contacted Regavim and said, we have a problem. The Bedouin who have always lived in this area, there's suddenly a permanent structure on the ground, and we don't know what to do about it. We know that when a permanent structure goes up, we're going to have a legal issue. So they hired us to do the research and to represent them in court. So we collected photos, aerial photos of the area. And what you're looking at here is an aerial photo from 1999, before Regavim existed, and before Khan al-Ahmar existed, because there's nothing out there. What you see here is one seasonal tent. It's the top of a tent. We have other angles and close-ups of it, but for a moment, take my word for it. This is what it looked like in 2008. You'll notice that that tent happens not to be there anymore, and there's a different tent on the ground. The highway is right here. And then we went a little further, and we got an aerial photo from 2013. Seasonal tents in another area a little bit further, set back a little bit further, but nothing really happening. When does it all really begin to hit the fan, as we say? When does it start to look like a village with 80% of the structures bearing European Union symbols? Well, this all really began to take off when in 2009, Salam Fayyad, the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, announced a plan for the creation of a de facto Palestinian state in Area C. What he said was, areas A and B are already under our control. We need to take area C, and then we will have our state that will connect all the way from Gaza, actually down to Egypt, through Gaza, all the way through Judea and Samaria, up through the Arab population centers of Wadi Ara, all the way up north to Lebanon and Syria. And how did they go about this? Look at the signs that you see here. All of these countries, in addition to the European Union itself, started pumping money in to support the creation of these outposts through illegal construction, specifically in Area C. Now, the same Bedouin that they're supporting here in Area C live in areas A and B. They also live in Jordan, and they also live in Lebanon. They live all through the Middle East. But there is nowhere else other than Area C, the area placed under full jurisdiction of the State of Israel under the Oslo Accords, nowhere else that the European Union and these European countries pay for illegal construction. Only here, only here. And here we mapped out all these outposts that we found and connected the dots. The purple dots, as I said, are these Bedouin settlements, outposts. The green dots are the places where we identified that 80% or more of all the structures on the ground bear foreign symbols, either European Union or European member states. That includes the UK, that includes Norway, Holland, Ireland, Sweden, France, Germany. All of them are in the act, and they are all pumping millions into illegal construction in a very, very specific pattern. Not here in Area A and B, not here where there's nothing to talk about, only in the areas that will create this spine of contiguity for the Palestinian state. When you connect the dots, the picture is very, very clear. So, the next slide, by the way, is just to give you an idea of the lengths to which the State of Israel has gone to resolve this problem without lifting a finger. And that is, this neighborhood that you see here was created by the State of Israel on Israeli state land, just outside the Arab section of East Jerusalem called Abu Dis, to rehouse the Bedouin who are living in those impossible conditions in those outposts, and offered them cash payouts to move here and free land and help to build. And they built them a school, and they connected it all to water and electricity. But the Palestinian Authority and the European Union go to court regularly, and they've done this through 6 rounds of Supreme Court hearings, which we have won each time, to defend, to force the Bedouin to stay in those inhumane conditions, rather than coming to an agreement with the State of Israel and relocating to a modern community here with fully developed residential plots, access to grazing land, access to employment here, access to roads, access to electricity, everything else. So this is what European money is creating. And this is what the Fayyad plan of the Palestinian Authority has set up. It's using the Bedouin as place markers to control key areas in Area C. And those black dots that I showed you around Givat Ze'ev, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at things that look like this. This is Khan al-Ahmar. This is what the entire international outcry is about. This is where the Palestinian Authority and the European Union are forcing some 80 Bedouin to live here on the road. This is Highway 1, right? It's a big highway, divided highway. They have no water, they have no electricity, they have no sewage. They dump their garbage, they burn it, they just live on the road. The kids' school is here. They throw rocks down on the road from school for entertainment. And although you can't see it in this photo, all of this land, this part was meant to expand the highway. And this part is part of an area that is meant for the expansion of Kfar Adumim, a Jewish community that is thriving, despite the fact that they're having a Bedouin city being built right in their front yard. So we have the same thing happening all through Area C. We have it happening all around Givat Ze'ev, where I live. I see it every day as I drive to work. And again, the state of Israel has done nothing about it. We've gone to court. We've won cases. The Supreme Court said in 6 different rounds of hearings that this is illegal. It is not in the best interest of the people living here. It is a danger both to the people here and to the people who use the road. It is an infringement on Israeli jurisdiction and authority, and should be removed, but it hasn't been removed, and it's still there. So that's what we do at Regavim. Now, let's go back here a second. About 2 years ago, it was at least 3 election rounds ago here in Israel. Recently, we've had a lot of elections, unfortunately. Prime Minister Netanyahu gave his word that Khan al-Ahmar would be relocated in a very short time. It's still there. The night before it was meant to be, really, everyone was meant to be moved to that picture that I showed you in the slide before. The Prime Minister called then Minister of Defense Avigdor Lieberman and told him not to do anything. What had happened was that Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, was on her way to Israel to receive an honorary doctorate from Bar-Ilan University. I was actually invited to the reception because my husband is a lecturer in the university. And she called Netanyahu and she said, if you do anything to Khan al-Ahmar while I am on the way, I will turn my plane around and I will never come back. This will be a major international incident. I personally would have said, bye, but Netanyahu folded, suspended the relocation of Khan al-Ahmar, and it's still there today. How many days? 637 days later. It's still sitting there after he promised that it would be done in a matter of days. And we have the same story repeating itself over and over and over again, all through Area C. Eventually, we received, no, I've gone too far, sorry. When this situation got out of hand, and when we reported to the government time and time again, and when we participated in Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee hearings time and time again, and finally convinced the government that this situation was out of control and that we were losing control of Area C, Prime Minister Netanyahu finally confronted the European Union itself, and the High Representative for the European Union at the time, Federica Mogherini, gave an EU commitment to desist from further construction in Area C. They would no longer fund construction in Area C. And we thought, this was about 3 years ago, and we thought this was a massive victory, and we were very, very excited. And then we realized that the European Union hadn't conceded the war. They had only conceded the tactic. And they moved on to a tactic which is far worse. And the tactic I'm going to show you now is why I gave you that whole history lesson about Ottoman land law. This is the new tactic. When they began to abandon the use of illegal construction to take over territory, they shifted to agricultural land seizure. Now, what does that mean? Under Ottoman land law, as I mentioned very briefly, if you use a piece of land, no matter how you acquired it, either by stealing it or by borrowing it and not giving it back, which is essentially the same thing, or just simply squatting on the land, not knowing whose it is and not caring, if you use it for a certain amount of time and no one protests, it becomes yours. That's Ottoman land law. In addition, Ottoman land law states that if a piece of property which is considered state land, if you can prove that at some point it wasn't state land, then it can no longer be considered state land. It won't necessarily be yours, but it isn't state land. So the Palestinian Authority has created a massive apparatus for taking advantage of these two loopholes in Ottoman land law. And this is what they've done. They've taken over, at this point, this chart was published about 2 years ago, so it's already out of date. The numbers here have already doubled since then. They've taken over tens of thousands of dunams of state land in Area C, strategically planting trees in areas that surround Jewish communities. They've done all of this using European Union money and European member states. They're planting trees. Now, unfortunately, what we didn't foresee when we lobbied successfully against the end of illegal construction was we didn't foresee this tactic. And this tactic is far more effective because for the price of building one structure or running one electric line, you can plant thousands of trees and take over 10 times as much territory, more bang for the buck, as we used to say in New York. So this is what we're facing now, tens of thousands of dunams of land. So Regavim, very, very early on, cottoned on to this tactic. We went to the courts and we said, this is outrageous. We went first we went to the civil administration. So what did the civil administration do? They simply took a pencil and areas that were area C before, they now appended them to areas A or B and said, we can't fight against this. We don't have the resources. So they gave up before the game started. And we went to court to represent Jewish communities that did the same thing. Since Ottoman land law applies both to Jews and non-Jews who are living in Judea and Samaria. So when Jewish communities planted trees outside of the municipal lines in order to secure the boundaries of their communities, the Supreme Court of Israel struck that down and said, Ottoman land law's protections are only apply to Arabs. They don't apply to Jews. Now, where I come from, that is discrimination by religion, race. I don't even know what to call it. It's outrageous discrimination, but that is the policy that is now in force. Jews cannot take advantage of the same clauses in Ottoman land law under which we are living as Arabs can. So you have that insane situation. You have the additional insane situation of Jews being forbidden in areas A and B and in all of Jordan. By the way, I would point out that the first and only country in the world that is officially Judenrein, where it is officially illegal for Jews to own property or businesses, was created by the United Nations, essentially, and that is Jordan. It is against the law in Jordan for Jews to own property or businesses. It is also against the law in areas A and B of Judea and Samaria under Palestinian Authority law. And anyone who does sell land to a Jew in areas A and B, it's punishable by death under the Palestinian Authority. And they do kill people who carry out transactions land transactions with Jews in areas in Judea and Samaria. So what you have here is a combination of outmoded law, discriminatory application of the law, clear anti-Semitic slant in the law, and this is the situation. This is why we and many others have been calling for the abolition of almond land law and the extension of Israeli law to Judea and Samaria. The situation under which I personally, and everyone in my community and all the communities out here are living is ridiculous. It is not something that people understand. When you say, sovereignty, not sovereignty, the anomalous situation of living under a system of law that was abandoned by its creators over 100 years ago, and the insane bureaucracy because we're living under military rule, these things are something that you'd have to see to believe. In the meantime, the Israeli authorities have essentially frozen the Jewish growth and development in these areas, and the Palestinian Authority has created incredible projects funded with endless European funding, and they're not standing still for 1 minute. So there are over 60,000 illegal structures in Area C, built by and supported by the Palestinian Authority. Tens of thousands of dunams, even more than that at this point, over 100,000 dunams of land have been lost to these agricultural projects, and the map is changing every single day, and the state of Israel is not doing anything to stop those changes. So just to recap and to try to wrap things up and leave some time for questions and answers, I'm just going to give you an overview. Judea and Samaria, this is what it looks like. This is a geographic map. It's 5.8 million dunams. Of that, areas A and B are approximately 40%, and 60% is area C. Again, areas A and B under Palestinian Authority jurisdiction, and 60% under Israeli jurisdiction. Zero Jewish settlement or life of any kind in areas A and B, and mixture in area C. Israeli settlements, Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, all together, those are the green dots. They cover less than 1% of all of Judea and Samaria. All the noise that you hear about the settlements being an obstacle to peace, and the settlements being illegal, and the settlements destroying Palestinian hopes, all Jewish settlement all together in Judea and Samaria accounts for less than 1% of the total territory. If you're talking about area C, the area under full Israeli jurisdiction, it comes to less than 2%. So it's not what it's cracked up to be. What you're looking at here, I'm going to show you the same slide in English. Again, all of Judea and Samaria, areas A and B are the pink, the brown is Israeli. A very large percentage of area C is inarable. It is mountain and desert. And here are the figures. Here's where you have it. In 2009, when the Fayad plan was first launched, we counted almost 30,000 illegal structures in Area C. But 10 years later, 2019, the number is now it's over 60,000. The Palestinian Authority is hard at work. It's using European funding to change the map. And now the red dots that you see here are strategically placed in order to make it impossible for the Jewish communities to connect to one another or to connect to Israel proper. They're cutting off the access surrounding the communities, very strategically placing these outposts so that a negotiated solution becomes impossible, and Israel is losing the battle on the battleground of Area C. I would be happy to answer any questions now.
Okay, can you hear me?
I hear you well.
Great. Thank you so much, Naomi. That was amazing. I think it's very important for people to have had a chance to actually see the pictures, which is why we were so happy to have you, because we are hearing theoretically about, through the concepts like international law, concepts like annexation, but nobody has on this side of the water any idea what that really looks like. And so that was astonishing.
You're not alone. I just have to add that most Israelis have no idea. And when we present our data to members of Knesset and now to new members of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Knesset, not all of them know what we're talking about either. So
I know that to be true because I've been to Israel a number of times. I have relatives and friends there, and none of them will leave Jerusalem and go and check it out. They actually don't believe that you go there, right? It's taboo. So before we go to questions from the audience, can you just speak to how that map would be affected if the Trump plan had been accepted, if there was an extension of sovereignty? Would it only apply to those communities that are still in Area C and are not occupied by Arabs, or would it cover all of Area C? What would it mean?
very good question. Now, the Trump plan is very amorphous. The Trump plan came with what they called conceptual maps. Conceptual maps were more or less a cartoon rendering of the map. They weren't actual maps. So what we did at Regavim was we anchored the concepts in those conceptual maps on actual maps. I can give another whole lecture on that another time, or if anyone is interested in seeing the results of our mapping, I can send it. It's much too complex to show on a small screen. You have to really look at it very carefully. But what we showed and what we actually presented to the American embassy staff, who were much more interested in hearing what Regavim had to say than the Israeli side were, which is astounding. But what we showed them is that the conceptual maps essentially are based on the Oslo division of the territory between A, B, and C. What they don't take into account is the actual reality on the ground that has been affected by all this illegal construction. So in many of the places where the conceptual maps show corridors to connect Jewish communities, those corridors don't really exist. They're not possible because they're already full of illegal Palestinian Authority created settlements. And
right.
You have to.
I wondered, was your perception that those communities, the illegal ones, would have to be removed in order to implement the plan?
Well, one of the basic concepts of the Trump plan is that no one will be moved, right? Okay. No one will be moved. So we said, you know what? It's not that the Trump plan is impossible. It's that it in order to take into account those realities, it has to be adjusted to reflect those realities. It is still possible to divide up the territory so that Jewish communities who travel to, people from Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria who travel to work in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or Beersheba or wherever it is, which is now a 15-minute drive, rather than making them go 2.5 hours and wow, circumventing the entire country, there are ways to do it if you look at the empty areas in areas A and B and abandon those rigid Oslo boundaries between A, B, and C, make land swaps essentially. Take areas that are either A or B but are empty, there's nothing built there, and give those to the Jewish side so that people can still continue to live, travel, and the communities will be able to expand normally. It's still doable, but you have to be realistic. You have to not look at the Oslo pie in the sky map that was created. You have to look at what's actually happened in all those years in the interim between the time that the Oslo map was created and now that the Palestinian Authority has been systematically undermining that map with the help of European countries for decades. So
okay, I have several people have asked a question and then I'll call on Goldie, but just before we do that, several people have asked, why can't Israel not prohibit the EU funding and the developments or the sending of all these portables and simply just not allow it?
It can. That's why I have a job. That's what Regavim is demanding. That's why we go to court. That's why we take the civil administration and the Ministry of Defense and the IDF and the Prime Minister to court on a regular basis, because those tools exist. The law exists. It's simply not being enforced. Okay. Or it's being enforced with tremendous partiality and prejudice. Whereas if a Jewish community, if somebody who, in my neighborhood, if I go 2 inches over the line that I have my permit for, my house will be knocked down. And we've seen it happen. We've seen it happen over and over again in Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, even places that were built with permits, and then the permits were later reconsidered. So you have the reassignment of the municipal blue lines by the Blue Line team. It's an outrage that homes that were given permits and were built perfectly legally were then redefined, and people 10 years after they moved into their homes are now all of a sudden lawbreakers, and those houses are knocked down. Whereas on the other side, the state of Israel has not enforced the law, has turned a blind eye because it didn't want to tangle with all of these European countries and the European Union itself. It's cowardice, and it's time for the state of Israel to grow up and behave like an adult, like a sovereign nation with rights, to defend its rights and to enforce its laws. Because if not, we will have chaos. We will have nothing.
Okay,
Without that basis in law, we have nothing to build on.
Thank you, Naomi. Goldie has a question. Goldie, you have to unmute yourself. Goldie, you have to unmute.
Can you hear me?
There you are.
Okay. Naomi, I have an important question, and I don't know how many in the audience are aware of the latest news of Trump having signed an agreement with the United Arab Emirates and Israel. Are you aware of this latest news? Which actually Netanyahu completely walked away from the deal, which in my opinion would have been a kiss of death for Israel, the way it was set up. It's just as well that there is no agreement right now, but I'd like your opinion. What is more important? Let's say the deal would have been acceptable, and now this new agreement with the United Arab Republic. How do you compare the importance between the two?
Thank you for that question. It's an important question. The normalization is what they announced this evening, full normalization between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. And we're all for normalization. We'd love to be normal. Normalization begins at home. The situation that we have here is abnormal. Prime Minister Netanyahu campaigned on normalizing our situation and life for Israeli citizens, and he has not lived up to that. He has essentially bartered our normalization for some theoretical normalization. I believe it is in the interest of the United Arab Emirates to normalize relations with Israel. It's something that they've been wanting to do. It's something that will benefit them. It will certainly benefit Israel as well, but we shouldn't be expected to pay the exorbitant price of continuing to live like vassals in our own country. And we should not be expected to permit constant violation of the law, of international law, of Israeli sovereignty, and of the rights of every single Israeli to live a normal existence in our one and only homeland. So it's a deal that we've been bartered. Essentially, we have been used as a bargaining chip. I personally feel betrayed to a large extent. I can't say that I'm shocked. Prime Minister Netanyahu has not made any moves that he could have made. And he has been far more interested in international issues. And I don't want to make a statement about his mindset, because that doesn't interest me. What interests me is that he has a responsibility to the citizens of Israel. He has a responsibility for the future of Israel, for the security of Israel, for the growth of Israel and the prosperity of everyone who lives here. And the way to achieve that is to extend Israeli law, to re-establish the originally intended borders and boundaries of Israel, to come from a place of strength and to negotiate in good faith with anyone who is willing to accept our normal situation. Okay. Right now, it's not normal.
I would like to thank you, Naomi. There are many more people who have questions. My suggestion would be, if people would like to have a question sent to Naomi, forward it to us. You can just send it to either Goldie or myself. I'm just Andrea, Andria, @caef.ca, or Goldie with an I, Goldi, at israelslegalrights.org. And we will forward it to Naomi. What I'd like to suggest, Naomi, if you're comfortable with it, is that if you provide answers, we will post them along with the recording so people will find the information that they're seeking. I really truly believe too few people understand the topography and what's involved in these communities, and have not visited Judea and Samaria, do not understand the nature of the Jewish heartland and how important it is to the entire country. So thank you so much for sharing.
I would like to add just one anecdote. I recently took the political division of the United States Embassy out into the field. Took them out to Judea and Samaria. Took them a 10-minute ride out of Jerusalem, and we stood in Gush Etzion at Neve Daniel's Outlook on a clear day. Took them up to this, it's in the middle of a neighborhood. In one direction, we saw the boats in the Bat Yam port, and in the other direction, we saw Jordan, past the Herodian and Jordan. And I said, okay, this is the entire country. You're looking across the width of the entire state of Israel. Now, the person who's in charge of the political division of the US Embassy here in Israel is a career diplomat. He's no fool. He was the chief of delegation in Jordan for many years. He's in Israel now. Very intelligent person, very well read and learned. And he stood there literally speechless because he had never actually confronted the very incredible smallness of the state of Israel and the importance of Judea and Samaria to Israel's security. He had nothing to say after that. He just had nothing to say. I welcome you all, anyone who wants to come out into the field, come to Israel when you can, hopefully sooner rather than later. I'll be happy to pass on my details. Be in touch with me. It's really simple to contact me. It's Naomi@regavim.org. I'll take you out in the field. I'll show you what it is that we see when we go out into the field every day, and you'll understand why we are so adamant.
Thank you. I think we should have titled this Defending Zionism, not just living it. Thank you so much for what you do. Thank you to all of Regavim. Thank you, Goldie, for partnering, and Regavim, and everyone have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Just a thank you from me personally, Naomi, and we do hope to collaborate in the future and find ways of doing our part, and you will guide us to what we can do.
Thank you so much.
Bye for now.